Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and I'd like to welcome all of you back to my 500 movies in 2025 series. And for this episode, this will be movies number 262 through 266. And this episode, I can't believe this, guys. I know this is probably nothing to anybody else, but I started this journey earlier this year in January, and now with this episode marks the 50th episode of this series of the 500 movies in 2025. For me starting at back at the beginning of this year, and what better way to commemorate the 50th episode than talking about one of my favorite subgenres of horror, and that's zombies. So, this week of the 500 movies in 2025, known as Week of the Living Dead, is dedicated to the memory of the legendary director and father of the modern zombie, George A. Romero. And as many Romero fans may already know, um, yesterday, July 16th, 2025, made 8 years to the date that George passed away. Um, it's a date in history that I will never forget, just because of how much he and his films meant to me, especially my favorite horror film of all time, Dawn of the Dead, which I covered here on the channel earlier this year. It was one of the very first movies that I covered in the 500 movies in 2025. So if you haven't seen that, that's in the very first episode. I talk about that movie. If you want to hear my thoughts on Dawn of the Dead, you can go back and watch that. Um, so two other dates that I'll never forget are March 27th, 2010 and November the 5th, 2010. So those dates are the days that I met George Romero um, in person at Horror Hound. So there, that picture right there is from Horror Hound in March of 2010 in Indianapolis. That was my very first time I ever got to meet George Romero, and then later that year, on November the 5th, 2010, at Scarefest weekend in Lexington, Kentucky, I got to meet him again. Um, and just, he was such a kind and friendly person during both of those times that I met him. And I'm so thankful, that Candace was there, with me, to meet him as well. At that second time at Scarefest, as that was her first ever Scarefest, her and I just started dating, very shortly before that convention, 15 years ago. Um, so that was just so cool to be able to meet someone that I had admired for so long in the movie world, especially someone who created my favorite horror film of all time. Um, it's a really special moment that I hold near and dear to my heart, and like I said, every year that passes by on July 16th, after he passed away in 2017. Uh, it's a day I'll never forget because it absolutely broke my heart when he passed away, and just it's not the same with him not being here. Especially, and if you know how he is, if you've met him, if you were a friend to him, or if you're just a fan of him that had met him at conventions, you know how much of a wonderful person that he was. And so getting back to the show that I'm be doing tonight. Um, so while not all of the movies that I'll be covering tonight, or the part two that I'll be doing on Sunday, um, may, while all of them may not have his involvement, this entire week is dedicated to him and what he did for the future of the zombie subgenre in horror. Starting back in 1968 with the granddaddy of all zombie movies, and that's Night of the Living Dead. And for those of us who are dedicated fans of George A. Romero, um, there's one undeniable truth that this all started in a graveyard. And before the shopping malls, before the underground bunkers, before the fortified cities, there was this lonely Pennsylvania cemetery. You know, and our brother, teasing his sister, and this single shambling figure that would just change the landscape of horror forever. Forever, and just to call Night of the Living Dead a mere zombie movie is really like calling a hurricane a bit of bad weather. It's a huge event. It's a cultural ground zero. And released in 1968, this was a year of just profound social and political upheaval. And this low budget, black and white, shocker film from a group of Pittsburgh filmmakers, it didn't just scare audiences. It held up a cracked and blood smeared mirror to the very society that was watching it. And my first viewing, which was so long ago, but it felt like a rite of passage. I didn't know that at the time, but looking back on that, that's how it feels to me. I was very young. This was in the early '90s, the first time I ever seen it. My dad was already a big horror fan, especially the classic stuff, the old black and white stuff. So he was a horror fan before me. And he was always trying to playfully scare me by showing horror movies on TV or on VHS tapes that we would rent. Always late at night. And when I first ever watched this film, and I'll never forget it, it was nothing like I had ever seen before up to that point. Just it was this, you know, and again, this is not thoughts I was having when I was a kid, but just looking back on it, it just, as a kid's point of view, this is just it's very raw and almost documentary style, like realism of, the film. It just felt less like a production and more like found forbidden footage or something. It wasn't slick, it wasn't polished. It just felt terrifyingly real. And the film opens with this kind of mundane simplicity. Barbara and Johnny are driving to this rural cemetery, Evans City Cemetery, to place this wreath on their father's grave, which is become this kind of tedious annual obligation to them. Um, and Johnny's childish taunting, they're coming to get you, Barbara. It is that scene right there is really the last moment of normalcy in this movie's world. Because when that first ghoul or zombie, whichever you want to call it, appears, all pale and clumsy, he isn't this like standard theatrical monster. He's a man in a rumpled suit, and the attack is just awkward and brutal, and Johnny's death is very quick, and his head cracks, against a tombstone, and over this happening, there's no swelling score, there's no dramatic final words, just that that sickening thud, and Barbara going through this kind of ensuing panic. Um, and Blake Mullins is in here. Hey, Blake, how's it going, man? You said crazy how Tom Savini was going to be involved in Night of the Living Dead, but he had to serve in Vietnam. And yeah, that's true. I didn't even think about that, but I do remember like reading about that a long time ago, and but that is true. Like but he would go on to work with Romero several times beyond Night of the Living Dead. And but man, just to think about if if he had the skill that he had with all the other projects that he did with Romero, if he would have got to work on him with Night of the Living Dead, how old would he have been? How old would Savini have been when Night of the Living Dead came out? Because that was 10 years prior to Dawn of the Dead, and I don't know. He had to be in like in maybe his late 20s or something like that. Um, but yeah, that's a really cool fact. That Tom Savini was supposed to be a part of Night of the Living Dead, but he had to serve in Vietnam, which is very it's a very bold thing to do and very like a honorable thing to do. I believe. And if you want to hear more of my thoughts on like Vietnam vets stuff, you can go watch my Fourth of July special when I'm talking about the movie Born on the Fourth of July. So yeah, so that's a whole interesting thing to itself. But but anyway, just that opening scene of Night of the Living Dead, you know, it's just the first stroke of Romero's genius. The horror of Night of the Living Dead is not rooted, in these gothic castles of that the Universal monsters and all the Universal movies were known for at the time in the horror genre, or any kind of atomic mutations like settings like back in the 1950s. This was just rooted in this kind of terrifyingly collapse of the everyday. Barbara, she flees to this seemingly abandoned farmhouse, which is a sanctuary that just quickly becomes a prison to her and everyone that's there. And it's here in this claustrophobic house that the film's true themes start to emerge with the arrival of Ben, who's played by the magnificent Dwayne Jones. It's a major turning point. All of a sudden, he is this competent, resourceful, rational guy. He boards up, the windows. He's seeking out weapons. He's thinking strategically. He's the hero that this situation demands. And soon they discover they're not alone. So hiding in the cellar is the Cooper family. First, you got this bitter, cowardly, husband and father, named Harry Cooper, and then his wife Helen and their daughter who's injured, Karen. And down there with them is this young couple, Tom and Judy. So instantly the true conflict of the film starts to be revealed right then and there. It's not man versus monster; it's man versus man. And these ghouls, these zombies outside are this relentless, unthinking force of nature. But the real danger, the real horror, is the people inside being unable to cooperate with one another. And I think the central struggle between Ben and Harry is really the film's thematic core. Ben, he advocates for fortifying the main floor, where there are escape routes and access to information, via the radio or the television. Then you got Harry, who's just consumed by fear, and selfishness. He insists, that the cellar is the only safe place. And their argument is not merely this tactical disagreement. It's this clash of these ideas that each one of them has. And Ben, he represents that kind of proactive survival, and collective effort, while Harry kind of embodies that that paranoid self-preservation, and just that the failure of that traditional, father, figure, husband figure to protect his family or anyone else. So he kind of Harry becomes that cancer within the sanctuary. Um, and then with every character beat, every decision, feels agonizingly authentic, I think, here. Barbara is not this final girl in the modern sense. She's just this woman that's shattered by trauma and rendered almost catatonic just by this horrific death of her brother that she witnessed. And just her paralysis is not a character flaw. It's just this painfully realistic depiction of shock. And then you look at the young couple, Tom and Judy, and they're just full of naive hope, which really makes their deaths, in the explosion and all that, all the more tragic and shocking. And it's really just kind of like this grim warning that good intentions are no match, for this new world. Um, but then you look at the ending of this film. This it's this soul crushing, nihilistic gut punch of an ending. You know, so just after this whole night of this unimaginable terror, after fighting off the living and the dead, Ben emerges as this sole survivor, and he's won. But as the morning sun starts to rise, he hears the sounds of this posse, outside, just clearing the area, and the film just shifts to kind of a newsreel style montage of these armed men, shooting all the remaining zombies. Being seeing this salvation, he approaches a window, and then the sheriff gives the order. Well, there's another one. Get him in the head, and then fire off this rifle, and Ben falls dead. And our hero, which is this capable black man who survived the apocalypse, is unceremoniously shot and killed by a group of white men who mistake him for one of the monsters. His body is thrown onto a bonfire with the rest of the ghouls or the zombies, and then that's it. The credits roll. Over these kind of this very like unfortunate happening. And in 1968, this was not just an ending. It was a political statement. Of devastating power. It cemented Night of the Living Dead as not just a horror film, but I think one of the most important pieces of social commentary of its decade. It was this perfect, although bleak, masterpiece. Um, And so let's go back for a moment and just talk a little bit more about George Romero. So, he is the director of this masterpiece, and he's widely regarded as the father of the modern zombie, and just a master of that socially conscious horror. Before Night of the Living Dead, Romero had co-founded the company, the Latent Image, which was this small commercial production company in Pittsburgh. And he and his friends, including John Russo, who was the co-writer of Night of the Living Dead, and then Russell Striner, who played Johnny. They kind of all owned their craft at making commercials and industrial films. And this whole background in that kind of pragmatic, low budget filmmaking was essential to the creation of Night of the Living Dead. So they all pulled their money together, and they used local actors. Many of those actors being investors in the film, and just and they all filmed on location. Just giving the film its kind of signature gritty, DIY aesthetic. And Romero's career is defined, I think, by his use, of the horror genre as this kind of vehicle for sharp, social and political commentary. His films are almost never just about the monsters. The monsters are a catalyst that exposes the flaws and the failures of humanity. And he's known, I think, primarily for his entire Dead saga. Night of the Living Dead was the first of a 6 film series, written and directed by Romero. Um, the most famous sequels are Dawn of the Dead from 1978, and which is this brilliant satire of just consumerism, set in a shopping mall, and then Day of the Dead from 1985, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. It was this kind of bleak examination of the military industrial complex, and that loss of scientific reason. And later films that he would do in that series, including Land of the Dead, Diary of the Dead, Survival of the Dead. But across his filmography, Romero was also known for just kind of tackling themes of racism, like in Night of the Living Dead, consumerism in Dawn of the Dead, militarism in Day of the Dead, classism in Land of the Dead, and the untrustworthiness of media in Diary of the Dead. But Romero almost always would set his films, in these familiar kind of blue collar American landscapes, primarily in Pittsburgh, which where he was from. This made that kind of fantastical horror feel immediate and plausible. And beyond zombies, he made tons of other different types of films, like Martin in 1977, which was this heartbreaking and realistic take on a young man who believes he's a vampire. And then you had like The Crazies from 1973, which is about this military made virus that turns this small town's population into these homicidal maniacs. um, like I said, I think Romero was known best for his Dead films, but he just has a whole catalog of films out there that he has done. Um, you know, that is just worth watching, worth talking about. And I love every single one of them. Um, George Romero was just, he was a true filmmaker. Just this independent maverick. Who proved that genre films could be intelligent. Subversive and just deeply personal. And I think for those reasons is why I fell in love with his films and deemed him as one of the greatest directors of all time in my eyes. Um, but the legacy and the impact of Night of the Living Dead is really staggering. It's one of the most influential films ever made. Regardless of genre. And it can its impact can really be broken down into 4 key areas. So the first one, this was with this movie, this was the invention of the modern zombie. Before 1968, the 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 standard zombie was in film was this kind of product of Haitian voodoo. This mindless drone that was controlled by a master, as seen in films like White Zombie from 1932, starring Bela Lugosi. Romero he drew inspiration from Richard Matheson's novel I Am Legend. And he just completely reinvented, the model zombie movie. And the Romero zombie had this new, terrifying rule book that has become principle for virtually all zombie fiction that has followed. And that's that they are reanimated human corpses. They are driven by this, insatiable hunger for living human flesh. Their bite is infectious, which passes on the plague. They're slow, they're shambling, they're relentless. Though there's later films that would experiment with speed and these zombies. But the only way to kill them is to destroy the brain. And every zombie that you see today, in The Walking Dead, 28 Days Later, World War Z, or video games like Resident Evil and The Last of Us, all of that owes its existence to those zombies that tormented Ben and Barbara, in that farmhouse. Romero created, that modern mythological monster of our time. And the second thing is this was a landmark in independent cinema. So Night of the Living Dead was produced for approximately $114,000, outside the Hollywood studio system. It's massive, commercial success, grossing over $30 million. Just it demonstrated that this regional, independently made film could find this massive audience and be profitable at the same time. It shattered that studio monopoly on feature film distribution and inspired this whole generation of just inspiring filmmakers. Including John Carpenter, Toby Hooper, Sam Raimi. Just to for those guys to go pick up cameras and just kind of make their own movies. It proved that vision and grit could triumph over a lack of resources. Um, and the third thing is, it really pushed the boundaries, of on-screen gore for that time. For 1968 audiences, Night of the Living Dead was shockingly graphic for that time. The scenes of these zombies, feasting on entrails, and that explicit act of this daughter, killing and eating her parents was that at that time it was unprecedented, in mainstream films. This film was released just before the MPAA rating system was fully implemented. Meaning it was shown to a lot of unsuspecting audiences, and including children, at matinees. And this kind of ensuing controversy and that moral panic kind of helped solidify the need for a formal rating system, to warn viewers of adult content, and forever changing how films were marketed and classified. And just think about that. Can you imagine being like a little kid and going with your family to a movie, not knowing really anything about it, that there's any adult content, and just going in there and just being scared shitless of what you're watching? I mean, in 1968, that just seems like that makes the legend, I think, even more awesome when it comes to Night of the Living Dead. So, like, I mean, it just I can't imagine, what that was like back then. But the fourth thing I wanted to get to is that Night of the Living Dead cemented horror, as a vehicle for social commentary, and it proved that horror could be, profoundly intelligent. The film is this powerful allegory for the social collapse of the 1960s. If you look at race, the casting of this black actor, Dwayne Jones, as the heroic and intelligent lead was revolutionary. Romero always maintained that he was simply the best actor for that part. You know, but the context that lies there is undeniable. In this was in a year that marked the it was marked by the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So seeing this black man take charge, only to be killed by a white posse was very visceral and devastating commentary on that state of race relations in America. Um, and then if you look at the Vietnam War during that time, and Blake mentioned that earlier because Tom Savini was currently serving in Vietnam during the filming and release of Night of the Living Dead. You know, this within this film, that whole grainy, black and white, cinematography, it really, it mimicked the newsreel footage of the Vietnam War that was being broadcast into American living rooms every night. And just the posse in this film, with their kind of indiscriminate killing, and that the film's kind of bleak, senseless violence, it mirrored those anxieties of an unpopular war. So and the film portrays this world where institutions have failed. The government and the military are these distant voices on the radio. They're unable to contain this crisis. The traditional nuclear family represented by the Coopers is dysfunctional, and they're paranoid, and just they're ultimately self destructive. The true horror in that is when society collapses, we turn on each other, and you know that I can see that in the past few years too. Like if you look at everything, starting back with COVID and just everything that was happening during that time, and then everything past that, you look at just how the world is changing year after year here the past few years. I just see people turning on each other more and more every day, and it's a really unfortunate thing. Um, but I'm not going to get into that. But I'm just in conclusion, as far as Not Living Dead, it's for me, it's more than a film. It's just this kind of cultural artifact. It's it is a raw nerve of a movie that tapped into that kind of turbulent zeitgeist of 1968 and has just remained terrifyingly relevant, I think, ever since. You know, George A. Romero did not just create a monster. He created a new genre and a new language for horror. One where the greatest threat is not the ghouls or the zombies at the door, but just that darkness within ourselves. And it's kind of has this bleak vision, this unflinching social criticism, and just it's the gut wrenching conclusion within the film are is really as potent today as they were over 50 years ago. It stands really as this testament to the power of independent filmmaking, and as the that foundational text of modern horror, which is a stark, brilliant, and just eternal nightmare. Uh, but yeah, so as you can see, I'm pretty passionate when it comes to Night of the Living Dead and Romero's films. And the fun doesn't stop there, because we're going to be talking about one other Romero film tonight. And it's not Dawn of the Dead, because I already covered that earlier in the year, like I said. So this next film, so for those of us who walk, that grim path, paved by George A. Romero, there is a holy trinity when it comes to his dead films, and that's Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. Night of the Living Dead was that shocking monochrome birth of a genre, a raw nerve of social terror. And then Dawn of the Dead from 1978, was this vibrant satirical adolescence, comic book splash of action and consumerist critique that became, for many, including myself, that the definitive zombie epic. It's my favorite horror film of all time. But then there is Day of the Dead from 1985. So Day is, to some people, is the trilogy's kind of difficult, angry, and profoundly misunderstood, adult. It it arrived not with the exhilarating chaos of dawn, but with this kind of suffocating subterranean dread. And audiences in 1985, I think a lot of people were expecting another shopping mall type romp, where instead, they were instead locked in this, concrete tomb, and forced to listen to, these bitter people screaming at each other for 2 hours, before all the bloodletting began. It was a commercial and critical disappointment, labeled as too talky, too bleak, and populated by characters that were, so abrasive that they made these, flesh eating zombies outside seem like, preferable company. But for me, I think they were completely fucking wrong. So to dismiss Day of the Dead is to, I think, fundamentally misunderstand what Romero was trying to achieve. This isn't just a horror movie. It's a like a Greek tragedy staged in this like Florida missile silo. It's the purest distillation of his central thesis, which is the zombies are not the problem, we are, and it's yeah, it is stripped of the adventure and the grand satirical set pieces. um, Day, I think, is Romero's final, furious statement on humanity's inability to cooperate, even with extinction knocking at the door. Um, and I wish more people would see it like that and straighten their asses up nowadays. But anyway, it's his most challenging, his most pessimistic, and I will argue his most one of his most profound masterpieces that he has made. Um, so the movie, it opens, in this world that has already lost. The zombie plague, which began as this kind of localized threat in Night of the Living Dead and became a national crisis in Dawn of the Dead, has now achieved this total victory. The film's haunting opening sequence shows our protagonist, Dr. Sarah Bowman, who's played by Lori Cardille, and she's landing this helicopter in this very desolate, abandoned Florida city. The streets are silent, save for the wind and the the moaning of thousands of undead who are shuffling towards them aimlessly. The currency of this new world is paper blowing in the wind. The war is over. The zombies have won. And the remnants of humanity, or at least this pocket of it, have retreated underground into this massive government bunker. And here we have this fragile and rapidly decaying truce exists between these two factions. So first you have the scientists who's led by Sarah, and just this team includes this increasingly unhinged Dr. Matthew Logan, who's played by Richard Liberty, whom all the soldiers there have nicknamed him Frankenstein. And he has this assistant, Ted Fisher, who's played by John Amplas. So their mission is to to study the undead, to find a way to reverse the plague, or failing that, control it. They they represent logic and reason and just that faint glimmer of hope that intellect can solve this crisis. But then you have the other group with the military guys. So they're this very small, exhausted and psychologically shattered unit of soldiers. They're tasked with protecting these scientists, and they're led by this belligerent and paranoid Captain Rhodes, who was played by the late great Joe Pilato. He's a man that was thrust into this position of power that he is utterly unfit for. He sees the scientists' work as a waste of time and resources, a waste of resources. For him, the only solution is extermination. He represents that failure of the old world's power structures, and this brute force, hierarchy, that toxic masculinity, now kind of curdled into this pure nihilistic rage. And I said there was two parties, but there's this third neutral party that exists in the film too, in the form of this helicopter pilot, John, who's played by Terry Alexander, and then his radio operator, McDermott, who's played by Jarlath Conroy. They are the film's philosophical center, believing that the human experiment has failed, and the only logical course of action is to fly away out of there to a secluded island and just simply live and just get on with their lives. So they offer this kind of path of acceptance rather than resistance. And the film's plot is not driven by external zombie threats, but by just that escalating psychological warfare within the bunker. And that claustrophobic setting just becomes like a pressure cooker. Sarah, she's fighting to maintain control and continue her research. Clashing constantly with Captain Rhodes, who just grows more and more tyrannical with each passing day. And just his authority is just absolute and enforced with these threats of execution. So the whole crux of the scientific plot revolves around Dr. Logan's grotesque but groundbreaking experiments, and this is one of the biggest things that really appealed to me when watching Day of the Dead, and still does to this day. He believes that these zombies retain these memories from when they were once alive, and they operate on this primitive instinct which can be harnessed. And his prize subject is, to me, what I consider the greatest zombie character of all time, Bub. Who is this captured zombie that he's attempting to domesticate. In this series of of amazing scenes throughout the film, Logan, starts to prove his theory to the rest of these people in this bunker. He teaches Bub to listen to music, to hold an unloaded pistol, and even to shave, even to hold a book upright. And but when Bub sees Captain Rhodes, he offers this kind of clumsy salute, which is um, tells Logan that this is like a ghost of his former military life, kind of flickering through his dead eyes. And Bub is not merely just like a what you call a tame zombie. Um, he is proof, that humanity, in some form, persists after death. He is the film's most sympathetic character, I feel. Just a symbol of a kind of potential future that the living are too busy destroying to notice. And this conflict, reaches its breaking point when Captain Rhodes discovers the true nature of Logan's research. He has been feeding the bodies of all of Rhodes's dead soldiers, part of his unit, to his zombie test subjects as a reward. So for Captain Rhodes, this is the ultimate betrayal. So he ends up executing Logan and his assistant Fisher without hesitation, and decides to just abandon the scientists to this approaching horde of zombies. And they're looking to take John's helicopter for themselves. And so this act of this supreme selfishness triggers the apocalypse within the apocalypse. Um, so there's this vengeful soldier, you know, excuse me, driven mad, just by the chaos. He opens the gates to this zombie infested surface. Miguel, if I hadn't mentioned him yet. But yeah, Miguel, another character who's seen as Sarah's boyfriend. He opens the gates to this zombie infested surface. Just letting the entire horde flood this complex, and just the final act is this breathtaking explosion of gore and poetic justice. And I still say to this day that the effects and the gore out of all Romero's films lies within Day of the Dead. I think the effects work here because not only you had Tom Savini, but you had Greg Nicotero doing effects here. And he was also Nicotero also had a small role in the film too. And I think Robert Kurtzman was working with them. I think they were doing. That was kind of begins of K&B, um, and so that whole production company with the effects company. So I think they were all kind of working on Day of the Dead. So just the special effects just came out fantastic in this film. And and they were all led by the legendary special effects artist, Tom Savini. So the soldiers, in the end, are just systematically and graphically torn apart. Um, and then you had the climax, and I think the climax, belongs to two characters here, and that's Captain Rhodes and Bub. As Captain Rhodes is trying to escape, he's cornered by this group of zombies, and on the other side of him, he's got Bub closing in on him, who's now armed and vengeful, seeing that you know this. Seeing Logan dead on the ground, who Bub was starting to look at as like a father figure. Strangely enough, so he haven't found Logan's body. Bub understands that his creator has been murdered. So he shoots Rhodes, wounds him. For all these other zombies swarm him, and I think in one of horror film history's most iconic death scenes. Rhodes screams as the zombies are just ripping him apart, devouring him, and he's like, "Choke on him, choke on him." I mean, to me, that's one of the greatest scenes in all of horror history. Um, it's this final pathetic spurt of defiance from this man who has just embodied humanity's worst impulses. Um, but ultimately, the film concludes with Sarah and John and McDermott escaping in the helicopter. Finally reaching this deserted tropical island. And it's this quiet, kind of ambiguous ending. They've survived, but humanity has not. So they're almost like the Adam and Eve and Steve, or however you want to look at that, since there's two guys there, in this dead world, leaving behind, just the human failure for this kind of fragile, uncertain peace. Um, and yeah, and to me, Day of the Dead, it's probably in Romero's Dead films, it may be my second favorite after Dawn of the Dead. And I know a lot of people are like, but what about Night of the Living? See, it's neck and neck. Like, I love Day of the Dead and Night of the Living Dead almost the same, but there's just parts of Day of the Dead that just are so much more special to me. That kind of gives it that edge. And again, we could talk about Romero a little bit more. Again, like I said, he just Romero famously fought, that the Hollywood system, which allowed him, this immense creative freedom, but often, kind of saddled him with these, budgetary constraints. And Day of the Dead was, originally envisioned as this much larger epic, uh, kind of seen as the Gone with the Wind of zombie films, but budget cuts, forced them to kind of scale it down to this claustrophobic, bunker setting, um, which is, a limitation that ultimately became the film's greatest strength. But Day of the Dead, this journey from it started off as this kind of box office bomb but now it's seen as this revered masterpiece by so many people. And I really think that's a testament to its kind of challenging vision that Romero originally had. Just that initially, audiences and critics failed to connect with its kind of oppressive atmosphere, and some of them called them the characters unlikable. Um, Captain Rhodes is not some charming villain. He's this pathetic, screaming tyrant. And Sarah is not this flawless hero. She's often cold and kind of single minded. But the film denies the audience that kind of cathartic fun of what Dawn of the Dead was. However, with the kind of advent of home video, viewers could revisit this film, outside the context of 1985's, blockbuster expectations. Um, just this kind of critical, reappraisal began, recognizing, the film, um, it's the film's intellectual depth, it's kind of daring, you know, pessimism, and just that sheer that power of just that of its it has this underlying message, and today I think it's widely considered, by a lot of horror fans and and Romero fans, to be one of his most accomplished works, which I think is a prophecy that feels more relevant, with each passing year. Um, but again, I won't get too far into that. But another thing is, this was the birth of the what they call the intelligent zombie. Bub is this revolutionary figure in zombie lore. Before him, zombies were almost exclusively mindless. These mindless eating machines. Bub introduced the idea that something of the person they once were, a memory, an emotion, and a learned behavior, all of that could remain. So this single concept has really had this huge impact on the genre. It paved the way for the thinking zombies in Romero's Land of the Dead, or the rage infected, learning to hunt in 28 Days Later. And then if you look at the countless moments in the Walking Dead TV series where a zombie is seen, fumbling with a doorknob or lingering near, a place of, personal significance, Bub humanized, the monster, and in doing so, made the world of the dead, infinitely more tragic and complex. And going back to Tom Savini, Tom Savini, who had created the iconic effects for Dawn of the Dead, considered Day of the Dead his masterpiece as far as effects go. He was disappointed, that he had to miss, working on Night of the Living Dead to serve in Vietnam. And I think he was like if somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he was like this a photographer over there in Vietnam. He poured all of his wartime trauma and technical genius into Day of the Dead, and just the film's gore is not just plentiful, but it's horrifyingly realistic and creative. Um, just if you look at the zombie that was on the operating table with his guts fall out, all his organs are exposed and still moving. That's an unforgettable image, just that the climactic massacre features some of the most elaborate and stomach churning practical effects ever put to film. And culminating with what I talked about earlier, Captain Rhodes' legendary demise, where he is just literally ripped in half by the horde. And these effects ended up winning, a Saturn Award, and it set this new, almost untouchable standard for gore in movies. Influencing these gorehound directors for decades to come. If you look at horror nowadays, like with like the Terrifier films and everything like that were gore, and all these practical effects in horror films is amped up, and it's like they're trying to outdo each other more and more these days. With and that all started with, I think, films like Day of the Dead, because that's what I was getting at with, like, influence on all these gorehound directors, that would come years and years beyond Day of the Dead. Hey Pop, how's it going, man? Oh, that's all right, man. It don't matter. You go back and watch what you missed later on the replay or something. Uh, but yeah, you were talking about Sylvania. He saw some messed up stuff, and yeah, man, like there's a my heart goes out to all those people that those Vietnam vets and stuff, and just especially and I talked about that a lot when I was covering Born on the Fourth of July, which is based on a true story, and just like a lot of those returning vets during that time just got oh man got treated terribly. It was just it's awful. Um, but yeah, man, I'm glad you're here. Thanks for coming tonight, man. What was I saying? Well, I guess I can talk about the let's talk about the bunker mentality of Day of the Dead. So Day of the Dead, I think, perfected the post apocalyptic theme of humanity's last remnants tearing each other apart in a confined space. So the screaming matches between Sarah and Captain Rhodes are more intense than any kind of zombie attack. Um, and the film brilliantly captures that, like I said, that bunker mentality. That psychological decay that sets in when hope is lost, and the enemy is no longer just outside the walls, but they're just sitting across the table from you. And I think this kind of template, this template, just that where the embattled scientist versus the paranoid soldier with just a few disillusioned souls caught in the middle has been replicated endlessly in zombie fiction, from video games like The Last of Us to TV shows like The Walking Dead. But I still got three more movies I got to talk about, so I guess I'll just go ahead and just kind of wrap this up for Day of the Dead. So I guess in conclusion, Day of the Dead is not a film that you enjoy in the conventional sense. It's a film that you endure. It's a very harrowing, claustrophobic experience that holds a mirror to our absolute worst impulses. It lacks that populist appeal of Dawn of the Dead, but it replaces it with something I think far more lasting, which is this cold, hard philosophical truth. Romero, he stripped away the adventure to ask the final terrible question of his trilogy, and that's when everything is gone. And, is what's left of us even worth saving? And Captain Rhodes, that shrieking, pathetic answer is a resounding no. but the quiet escape of Sarah and John and McDermott, suggests something else. It suggests that salvation doesn't lie in fighting the old world's wars, or trying to scientifically resurrect its corpse. It lies in letting go, in finding a new, quieter way to be human. And for a Romero fan, and unfortunately, this will be the last Romero film that I'll be talking about for tonight. Um, but let me say that Day of the Dead is, that final bitter sacrament. It's the film where the subtext becomes text, where the social critique is no longer a metaphor, but a direct, screaming indictment. It is a masterpiece of despair, a requiem for a species that had all the chances in the world and just squandered them, on rage and fear. It's pure, uncut Romero, and I swear this movie is damn near perfect. Um, but yeah, you guys let me know what you think about it. Do you agree with me in any way? How do you feel about Day of the Dead? I should have asked the same question about Night. How do you feel about Night of the Living Dead? What are your thoughts on it? How did you come in contact with those films. What about them appealed to you? But like I said, you can leave me that in the comments or in the chat, whatever you like. But I'm going to go ahead and go on now. Like I said, unfortunately, no longer talking about Romero films tonight. But, overall, this entire week is dedicated to George Romero. But the next film, so as a huge fan of the zombie apocalypse subgenre, my tastes, have been forged, I think, obviously, from, all the grim, blood-soaked landscapes of George Romero's Dead Saga, and even to the, horrific comedic landscapes of the Return of the Living Dead series. Fans like myself are, just we're connoisseurs of these shambling hordes, and just the desperate sprint through corpse-strewn streets, and just that gut-wrenching moral compromises made in the name of survival. We thrive on the grit and the gore and the dread. So when I tell you that one of my all-time favorite end of the world 80s films features Uzi toting Valley Girls, in a synth pop, shopping montage, and zombies that are less undead and more kind of cosmic jerky, it might make you raise an eyebrow, But to me, that's the glorious, neon-soaked paradox of Now the Comet from 1984. It's the apocalypse as a John Hughes movie. And it is, without exaggeration, I think, a masterpiece of the genre. Um, so let's get the big question out of the way: are the antagonists in Night of the Comet really zombies? So the purist in me wants to say no. They aren't reanimated corpses, driven by a hunger for flesh. They are these living people who were, partially exposed to the comet, causing their bodies to slowly dehydrate and decay into this malevolent, dust-covered ghoul. Um, so their minds erode, leaving behind this primal, aggressive intelligence. They can kind of talk. They can use tools, and they seem to kind of retain fragments, a little bit of their former lives. So no, they aren't your traditional ghouls or zombies, but what they represent is a brilliant and refreshing take on that theme. Um, they are the process of death personified. That slow decay, made manifest, um, and just instead of a bite that turns you, it's a cosmic event that erases you, and and these poor souls are just caught in the middle of the process. And for a zombie fan, this is very unique and very fascinating. I think it sidesteps that kind of magical, um, viral cliche, and presents something grounded in its own bizarre sci-fi logic. Um, but the zombies, if you want to call, I think I still call them zombies. I don't know about anybody else, but because they're even referred to that, in the film. But they're almost secondary, I think, to the film's true focus and its greatest strength, which is the survivors. So we got our heroes here, our sisters, Regina and Samantha Belmont, who were played by Catherine Mary Stewart and Kelly Maroney. And Regina, or Reggie, or Reg, as she puts into the arcade game that she plays in the beginning. She's this pragmatic, video game loving, gun proficient older sister. And you have Sam, who is this kind of quintessential '80s teen queen, a cheerleader more concerned with boys and her hair, and than the celestial event that's about to wipe out civilization. So their survival is just pure luck. So Reggie spent the night in this projection booth at the movie theater where she works, and Sam had this fight with their wicked stepmother, and she slept in this metal garden shed. So when they emerge into this silent, rust colored Los Angeles, their reaction isn't despair, but more of this kind of bewildered, almost giddy sense of freedom. It's this is where I think Night of the Comet truly separates itself from other zombie films. The film really understands something fundamental, and for a teenager, the end of adult supervision might initially seem like a dream come true. And this leads to this legendary shopping spree montage where it's set to Cyndi Lauper's "Girls Just Want to Have Fun." So our heroes, or our heroines, if you want to call them that, raid this empty department store, trying on these high fashion, and just kind of gleefully arming themselves with these Uzis. It's a moment of just kind of pure, unadulterated joy in this face of oblivion. In a genre so often defined by suffering, um, the celebration of life and youth and agency is profoundly cathartic here. Um, like I said, you have to leave. I got a big day tomorrow. Good job covering these movies. Keep up the good. Thanks, man. Appreciate you stopping by. Stop by anytime, man. You want. I really appreciate it. Um, but yeah, I mean, Catherine Mary Stewart and Kelly Maroney are perfect for these roles, though. They're kind of their sisterly chemistry is just really the anchor of the entire film. Their dialogue is sharp and witty, and just feels very authentic. They bicker, they support each other, they face the apocalypse not as these like hardened soldiers, but as these sisters who just happen to be surprisingly resourceful. And Reggie's kind of cool headed competence with firearms is never treated as unbelievable. She grew up with a military father, and then have Sam's kind of initial you know her being naive really gives way to this very fierce survival instinct. They're not these typical damsels in distress, waiting for a man to save them. And when they meet this fellow survivor Hector, he becomes a partner to them. Not a savior. In fact, they save him as much as he helps them. So this now brings me to the other threat, which is a staple, I think, of the whole zombie genre, is that realization that other humans are the real monsters. The film delivers on this with this kind of shadowy group of scientists who also survived in this underground research facility. These aren't cannibalistic marauders. They are these cold, logical men who have, discovered they too are decaying, just more slowly. And their solution is to find these uninfected survivors, drain them of their blood, and then kill them to halt their own, decomposition. And it's a classic theme, handled with the film's signature 80s sci-fi campiness. That ensuing conflict turns the final act into this thrilling, sci-fi action film where Reggie and Sam, they got to outsmart this group of these supposedly brilliant men who severely underestimate them. So, as a huge zombie film fan, Night of the Comet, I think, is just the perfect palate cleanser. It's an apocalypse with a sense of humor and style. It reminds us that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about living. It's about finding joy in a world, stripped bare. About um, the bonds that matter when everything else has turned to red dust. It's a film that proves that you can face the end of the world and still have fun doing it. It's vibrant, it's clever, it's endlessly rewatchable. I absolutely love this movie. It's a pop art painting in a gallery full of grim, grayscale photographs. Um, and that's one of my best ways to describe how amazing this movie is. But the director of this movie is Tom Eberhardt, and Tom Eberhardt, he has a very filmography. He's overwhelmingly, I think, best known for Night of the Comet. Um, I think it remains, his signature work and the film that really kind of cemented his place, in cult movie history. Um, but his direction on this film is really noted for its kind of clever balancing of you know, disparate tones like horror, comedy, teen drama, sci-fi. Just without ever letting one overpower the others. You know what I mean? And he just imbued the film with this strong visual style. Making excellent use of this empty Los Angeles, in the streets of Los Angeles, and just this with this vibrant, very neon tinged color palette that just perfectly captured that whole 1980s aesthetic. Um, but I only know Tom Eberhardt from one other film personally, and that's Captain Ron from 1992, which starred Kurt Russell and Martin Short. Um, and that would maybe be a fun one to cover someday on the channel because I'm a huge Kurt Russell fan. Um, but while he directed other features and television episodes, Tom Eberhardt's legacy is primarily defined by his ability to create these kind of quirky, you know, uh, character-driven films that often blend genres. And Night of the Comet definitely stands as I think his most influential and beloved contribution to movies. Um, but when you think about the legacy of this film, I think it's far greater than its modest box office returns would suggest. Um, it has evolved from this simple '80s genre film into a kind of highly influential cult classic. Um, just with this kind of lasting impact on pop culture. And it's crazy because there's a lot of films like that these uh, with these same actresses. If you look at Catherine Mary Stewart, also part of The Last Starfighter or The Weekend at Bernie's. She was just, and those films are cult classics. And you got Kelly Maroney, who was a part of films like Fast Times at Ridgemont High, Chopping Mall, just to name a few. All of them cult classics as well, and just like I said, all those films that I've named they all have this very lasting impact on pop culture, um, and just the its primary legacy with Night of the Comet is its enduring status as a beloved cult film. I think this is due to its unique charm. The quotable dialogue, um, just that perfect encapsulation of that '80s zeitgeist, from the fashion and hairstyles to that synth pop soundtrack. It's what you would call like a comfort food, movie for a generation of fans. Passed down through VHS, DVD, and now streaming. And I honestly have never met anyone who has seen this film and did not like it. Um, and if you look at this, one of the biggest things about this film is it really helped pioneer a lot of strong female protagonists in horror. This is in an era where scream queens and final girls were often defined by their victimhood before their eventual triumph. Reggie and Sam were really kind of revolutionary. They're these proactive, intelligent, capable from the start. They're not defined by their relationships with men. Their sisterly bond is the film's core. They rescue themselves and others. They're wielding these automatic weapons. Not as kind of a phallic substitute, but as just practical tools for survival. This progressive portrayal of female characters was years, I think, ahead of its time, and is a major reason for its lasting appeal. Um, this film was actually a direct influence on one of my favorite TV shows of all time, Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I think it. Joss Whedon, who created Buffy the Vampire Slayer TV series, this is that most significant and direct impact on him. um, he's explicitly cited Night the Comet as a major inspiration for Buffy. Just the parallels are undeniable too. This seemingly superficial blonde California teenager, Sam and Buffy, who is just revealed to be this formidable fighter against these apocalyptic forces. And the subversion of the ditzy blonde as victim theme, that the witty dialogue, and just the blend of that teen angst, with supernatural horror that defined Buffy, are all present, in the DNA of Night of the Comet. It can be seen as this kind of spiritual godmother to the entire Buffy verse, not just Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but Angel, everything associated with Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Um, but, just Night of the Comet really helped also pioneer a subgenre that could be called the cozy or fun apocalypse. Unlike that that bleak survivalist horror of its contemporaries, the film finds joy and liberation in the end of the world. That, like I said, that iconic shopping montage is just the ultimate expression of this idea. That the apocalypse can also be an adventure. And this same tone influenced later works that found humor and humanity and global catastrophes such as Shaun of the Dead and Zombieland. Um, but I guess in conclusion, Night of the Comet is far more than just another '80s B movie. Um, it is just it's a smart, funny, and just surprisingly progressive film that just flipped genre conventions on their head. By placing these two capable and charismatic sisters at the center of its story, it really created protagonists who were both relatable and aspirational. It's its unique take on the zombie is really this kind of masterful blend of horror and comedy and sci-fi, and just that that unabashed '80s style have really just secured its place as an essential cult classic. For any fan, I think, of the apocalypse genre, it definitely stands as this vibrant, witty, and just utterly charming reminder that even when the world ends, it doesn't mean that the fun has to stop. And I'll leave it that at that with Night of the Comet. I absolutely love that movie, and just if you've never seen it, I highly suggest it. It's definitely fun. I think if it's after you watch it for the first time, it's going to be one of those films for a long time where you're going to want to watch over and over and over again. But moving on from Night of the Comet to Night of the Creeps. And man, oh man, I love this movie. So as a lifelong fan of zombie movies, I've just about seen it all. Yet, there's one film, from that golden age of '80s horror that, for many of us in the know, it kind of stands as this almost like sacred text. It's a film that doesn't just use the zombie theme, but elevates it, and wraps it in kind of layers of sci-fi, kind of like how Night of the Comet did, and also that teen comedy and that kind of hard-boiled noir. So in a sense, like it would be good to watch Night of the Comet and Night of the Creeps as a double feature since they're both very relatable. Um, but it just this film really creates something so utterly unique and joyous that it deserves its place as one of the greatest of the genre, in my opinion. Um, and you know that film, like I said, is Fred Decker's 1986 masterpiece, Night of the Creeps. You know, so for the people that's not familiar with Night of the Creeps, the film may sound like a chaotic mess on paper, but for those of us who appreciate the kind of intricate clockwork of genre filmmaking, this is a symphony. It's a film that looks you dead in the eye, puts a shotgun in your hand, and dares you with its iconic catchphrase, "Thrill me." And man, does it thrill you! So to truly appreciate Night of the Creeps, you just have to understand its brilliant, multi-layered, you know, narrative structure. It's a story that is told in three distinct flavors, um, all converging into this kind of spectacular, explosive climax in the end. Um, so the film opens, not in 1986, but in this stark black and white nostalgia of 1959. And we start off on this frantic alien spaceship, um, and these two aliens are scrambling to contain this rogue experiment, which has been another alien on that ship is has stolen and is trying to launch it into this canister into space. So that alien succeeds at doing that, which probably and then this canister, it crash lands on Earth right near this university on Sorority Row. So we're immediately plunged into this classic '50s B movie territory. This young couple who are like making out in a car, and then you have this escaped mental patient who has an axe, and then this lovesick like college boy who stumbles upon this alien canister, and when he investigates this parasitic slug-like creature, which we call a creep, it leaps from the canister and violently launches itself into the boy's mouth. So it's this very shocking, jarring open that perfectly sets the stage, and promises us this film that reveres its movie ancestors. So now we flash forward to 1986, and we meet our heroes, Chris Romero, played by Jason Lively, and his disabled, perpetually wisecracking best friend JC, played by Steve Marshall. And their names, of course, are the first of many loving winks to the audience. And this is a nod to the horror masters, George A. Romero and John Carpenter. And Chris and JC, they're just like the quintessential '80s nerds. Desperate to find social acceptance, and for Chris, to win the affection of the beautiful sorority girl Cynthia Cronenberg, which is another brilliant genre name drop, and you'll see a lot of that within this film. So, in this kind of harebrained scheme to join the Beta fraternity, Chris and JC are tasked with stealing this cadaver from the university's medical research lab and to dump it on this rival fraternity's lawn. So inside the lab's cryogenic wing, they don't find just a random John Doe. They find the frozen body of the boy from 1959. And in this kind of moment of panic, they run out of there screaming like banshees. Another line from the film, if you're not familiar with it, sorry for that bad interpretation. But not before the corpse, stalls, just enough for these alien slugs, which have, been incubating inside that body for 27 years, to asexually reproduce and reanimate their host. So this original victim escapes, and then this is where the horror begins. So, and this is where the film's kind of unique zombie mythology is established. And for a zombie fan, it's fascinating. Just like how I called Now the Comet fascinating for its kind of ideas for what they did with that film. But the alien slugs in Night of the Creeps are the vector. They enter a host through the mouth, travel to the brain, and effectively turn this person into like a walking puppet. In this case, it's a zombie. And these zombies are the slow, shambling, and just single-minded. But here's the twist. Here's the genius twist. Is the slugs are also the payload. And when a host zombie is sufficiently damaged, particularly with a shot to the head, the skull doesn't just cave in, it explodes, releasing this fresh batch of these slithering creeps to infect new victims. So this creates this very terrifying cycle of contagion that is both visually disgusting and narratively brilliant. As the body count, begins to rise, and the zombified students, pets, and faculty members are beginning to terrorize the campus. One man understands the gravity of this situation, and that's Detective Ray Cameron, played with perfection by the legendary Tom Atkins. So Cameron, which is another ode to a genre filmmaker and James Cameron. But Cameron is not just a cop here. He's a character, ripped straight from this, Raymond Chandler novel. If you out there know who Raymond Chandler is. So he's haunted, he's suicidal, he's armed with this kind of bottomless well of one-liners like, what is this, a homicide or a bad B movie? You know, we learn that his tragic past is directly tied to the 1959 prologue. The ex murderer killed his high school sweetheart or ex girlfriend, whichever you want to call it. So Ray Cameron has been waiting his whole life for something this bizarre to give his life meaning. And he attacks that problem with a sawed-off shotgun and just a grim determination. So the film culminates in this kind of glorious siege, at Cynthia's sorority house, which, really is a direct and loving homage to Night of the Living Dead. So our surviving heroes here, Chris, Cynthia, and Ray Cameron, they got a band together to fortify the house against this growing horde of zombies. And what follows is really, to me personally, one of the most satisfying third acts in horror history. Complete with flamethrowers, exploding heads, a zombified bus driver, JC's posthumous instructions on how to kill the creeps. I love that scene when Chris finds the tape and listens to it, and it's heartbreaking, but like it's what makes this film so special and so appealing to me. Um, it's just it's a perfect blend of that high stakes horror, character driven emotion, and just that that pitch black dark comedy. Um, so let's talk about the director a little bit. So the mad genius who orchestrated this perfect symphony of chaos was this young writer director named Fred Decker. And if you watch the channel and you've heard me talk about Fred Decker, you know that I'm a huge fan. And in the mid '80s, Fred Decker emerged as this powerful new voice in genre cinema. A filmmaker whose love for the movies of his youth was not a gimmick, but that very foundation, of his storytelling. And Fred Decker's filmography is small, but it is huge for me personally. It's defined by his just incredible talent, for genre blending and that heartfelt homage. Before directing, he co-wrote the story for another beloved '80s horror comedy, House, which I'm a huge fan of, and I'll be talking about the whole House franchise later this year here on the channel. And but the original House from 1986, you know, it mixed that haunted house horror with that Vietnam War trauma and slapstick comedy. But Night of the Creeps was his directorial debut, and it remains as one of his most purest mission statements. It demonstrates his encyclopedic knowledge of film history, from 50s sci-fi and film noir to the 70s slashers and 80s teen comedies, and just his ability to weave these disparate threads into a coherent, wildly entertaining tapestry. He doesn't mock these genres; he celebrates them. And just 1 year later, he would cement his legacy with his other undisputed cult classic, one of my top favorite films of all time that I covered here on the channel earlier this year, The Monster Squad from 1987. And if Night of the Creeps was his love letter to zombies and sci-fi B movies, the Monster Squad was his tribute to the Universal monsters. It took Dracula and Frankenstein's monster, the Wolfman, the Mummy, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, or the Gill Man, whichever you want to call him, and just pitted them against this group of these savvy, foul-mouthed kids in this film that felt like The Goonies meets Hammer horror. And like Night of the Creeps, it was a box office disappointment, unfortunately, but found its audience on home video and just became this kind of generational touchstone. um, and together, Night of the Creeps and the Monster Squad really define Fred Decker's legacy. He is one of the kings of the '80s cult films. As a director who was years ahead of his time, I think, in crafting these self-aware, witty, and just deeply sincere genre mashups that just rewarded viewers for their own love of movies. Um, but as far as Night of the Creeps goes, upon its release in 1986, like I said before, it ended up being this commercial failure. It was poorly marketed and just misunderstood by a studio that didn't know if it had a horror film, a comedy, or a sci-fi film, on its hands. But the answer, of course, was that it was all three. But in the '80s, that was a tough sell. Um, but its true legacy was forged not in the theaters, but it just that glowing light, that holy grail that is VCR players and on late night cable television that helps establish films like Night of the Creeps, like Night of the Comet, as these cult classics. It was here that this generation of horror fans, myself included, discovered this hidden gem. Which I obviously did because the year this movie came out, that's the year I was born. So clearly, I didn't go to the theaters to see this, but I did. But I was one of those people that did discover this on VHS back in the 90s. It just for a lot of people, it became this kind of word of mouth, classic. A film that you excitedly recommend to friends with the promise of you have to see this. And the thing is with me, like, and I think this is the same thing for a lot of people too. If you're growing up going to the video stores in the '90s, some of the movies that you would rent, you didn't really know what you were going to get. You just had to go based off a description on the back of the box and a few pictures from scenes in the film. But I always would rent stuff a lot of the time based off the artwork on the cover of the box. Sometimes I would get some really bad films, I would rent and watch. But then again, I would get films like Night of the Creeps. Um, and I just remember renting the tape because on the box it has that scene right at the end with Chris and Cynthia, battling in front, these zombies in front of the sorority house, and I just thought that was a really cool looking, image, and the film itself just ended up becoming one of my favorite zombie movies of all time. Um, and just the impact that this film has is most profoundly, felt in its pioneering use of that meta commentary and genre blending. Long before Scream from 1996 was praised for its kind of self-referential, deconstruction of the slasher genre. Night of the Creeps was doing it with a far more affectionate touch. The characters' names, Cameron's, uh, B movie dialogue, and just the very structure of the film are all this conversation with the audience about the genres that we love. And it really laid the groundwork for a new kind of horror comedy, one that was both genuinely scary and genuinely funny, without ever kind of tipping into outright parody. You can draw a direct line from Night of the Creeps to some of the most beloved genre films, of the 21st century. If you look at James Gunn's film Slither from 2006, it in many ways is a spiritual successor, featuring its own slimy, slug-like alien invaders, a small-town siege, and just a perfect balance of body horror and black comedy. And then if you look at like Edgar Wright's Shaun of the Dead from 2004, it shares that same kind of DNA, focusing on these kind of relatable, funny characters, caught in a zombie apocalypse and just filled with these kind of deep cut homages to the genre's history. Um, Fred Decker just proved that you could have your cake and eat it too, and that you could make a legitimate, terrifying zombie film that just also happened to be hilarious and heartfelt. And I guess, and furthermore, just the film's characters have just left this, huge mark on a lot of fans. Tom Atkins, Detective Cameron, is become an icon of the genre. He is that, that model character of that, that grizzled, like, cynical hero with a broken heart, and Tom Atkins's performance is awesome here. He embodies like the film's just entire, you know, thing where he's just like he's tough, he's smart, he's funny, and just surprisingly poignant. For fans, fans quote his lines all the time to this day. I got good news and bad news, girls. The good news, your dates are here. The bad news is they're dead. That's to me that's an iconic line, especially in the whole zombie subgenre. Um, but the film's ultimate vindication, I think, came with the 2009's director's cut DVD and Blu-ray release. Um, for years, fans had only known the theatrical ending where Chris and Cynthia they survive, and Cameron appears to just die in the house explosion. Um, the director's cut restored Fred Decker's original, more apocalyptic vision, where after the credits we see um, Cameron's zombie still smoking a cigarette, as his head splits open and the creeps slither out towards the cemetery, just implying that the nightmare is far from over. Um, and this release was just a massive event for the cult following. A confirmation that the film was finally getting the respect that it had long deserved. Um, but I guess in conclusion of Night of the Creeps is more to me than just a zombie movie. It's a time capsule of everything that made '80s genre filmmaking great. It's audacious, it's inventive, it's crafted with this kind of infectious passion that pours from every frame. It respects its audience's intelligence and rewards their love for the history of horror at the same time. It really presents this very unique, and this unique spin on the undead. And it introduces, I think, one of the genre's most beloved heroes in Detective Cameron, and it balances its tones with the skill of this master conductor in Fred Decker. So, for any zombie fan, I feel like Night of the Creeps is an essential rite of passage. And I'm so sorry if you've still not seen the film and you're a zombie fan, but this is definitely one that's essential. It's a must watch as a zombie fan. It demonstrates that the living dead are not a monolithic concept, but a wonderfully just flexible, canvas for telling stories that can be terrifying, hilarious, and even moving at times. It stands, I think, as a testament to the power of a singular creative vision. A cult classic that has rightly earned its place in this world of horror greatness. Um, so to anyone who loves this genre and asks, if an old '80s movie can still deliver the goods, yeah, and I think Night of the Creeps is a perfect example of that. So, in the words of Detective Ray Cameron, thrill me. All right, guys. So I'm on to the last film I'm going to be talking about for tonight, and then I'll be back on Sunday with several more zombie movies I'll be talking about. Um, but for this last film I'm going to be talking about tonight, so as I've stated many times now, as a fan of the undead, I've almost seen it all. From Romero's social commentaries to Fulci's eye gouging gore fest. And I've even sprinted alongside these rage-fueled infected of Danny Boyle. I appreciate the slow, shambling dread and the fast, ravenous terror. But ever so often, there's a film that comes along that really throws the entire zombie rulebook into a wood chipper, douses the remains in gasoline, and lights that motherfucker on fire. And that film, my friends, is Dead Heat from 1988. And it is without a shred of doubt one of the most criminally underrated, deliriously fun, and just utterly bonkers gems in the entire horror, action, zombie, buddy cop world. If you're looking for a serious exploration of the human condition in the face of annihilation, well, you're in the wrong fucking place with Dead Heat, because that Dead Heat is not that movie. This is the film that you get when you throw Lethal Weapon, Reanimator, and a case of Jolt Cola into a blender and hit puree. It is a high octane, wisecracking buddy cop movie where one of the buddies just happens to be this rapidly decomposing zombie. and it is wonderful. So our heroes are the LAP detectives, Roger Mortis, kind of like rigor mortis. Get it? All right. I know it's kind of lame, but it's funny at the same time. And he's played by the late great Treat Williams, and then you have Doug Bigelow, who was played by Joe Piscopo. So Treat Williams plays Roger Mortis with the weary but charming swagger of this classic '80s action hero, while Joe Piscopo, toning down his SNL shtick just enough, provides, the loudmouth, girl crazy comic relief. And their chemistry together is really the engine of this film. So their banter really feels lived in and genuinely funny. It's kind of grounding that absolute absurdity that's about to unfold here, and they stumble, upon this series of heists that are perpetrated by these criminals who can absorb an ungodly amount of gunfire without flinching. So during this kind of spectacular shootout in this jewelry store, Roger discovers why these guys are already dead, and in the ensuing chaos, Roger himself is killed, and he's trapped in this depressurization chamber used for animal euthanasia. And this is where the movie goes from a fun action flick to this kind of legendary piece of genre filmmaking. So Roger's devastated partner Doug, finds this mysterious piece of equipment at the crime scene, and with the help of the coroner Rebecca, they use it to bring Roger back to life. And the catch is he's a zombie. He's still got his mind, he's got his badge, his gun, but his body is on this kind of ticking time clock. He has about 12 hours before he dissolves into a pile of goo, basically. Um, so the title isn't just a clever pun, it's the plot. Roger is literally in a dead heat against his own decomposition to solve his own murder. And what follows, is this absolute like masterclass, I guess, in practical effects and and body horror, and it's executed with this kind of glee that is just infectious. So this film is just a shrine to the art of latex and air bladders and caro syrup. So the set pieces are the stuff of legend for genre fans. The scene I'm talking about if you've seen this movie, and that's the resurrected butcher shop. So when Roger and Doug investigate a lead, they find themselves in this refrigerated nightmare where this entire butcher shop's inventory, a side of beef, plucked chickens, a pig's head, is all reanimated into this kind of grotesque meat flinging army. And it's just really like a gory ballet of just flapping poultry and swinging sausage links, and it's just simultaneously horrifying and hilarious and just honestly artistically brilliant. It's a sequence that could only have been born from just that unhinged imagination of the 1980s. And just the hits keep coming. We see a villain melt into a puddle of bubbling flesh. We see this reanimated biker get his head twisted 180 degrees and keep on ticking. Treat Williams brilliantly portrays Rogers' slow decay. He checks his hand to find it's turned, a pasty gray. He staples this a loose flap of his own cheek back on, and just his attempts to eat a donut are just hilariously. It's just hilarious. It's this commitment to the bit that elevates Dead Heat from B movie schlock to this kind of A tier cult classic. Um, the film really understands its premise, and it's ridiculous, and it leans into it with this kind of you know just everything that it has in it. Just the one liners are sublime in their corniness. When a zombie thug tells them to drop their guns, Doug retorts, "You're under arrest," and the zombie sneers like, "For what?" So Doug's perfect reply, "For being dead." And who could forget, that immortal line delivered by Roger himself? You have the right to remain silent. You also have the right to remain dead. It's just stuff like that. It's just so hilarious to me. Maybe that's just me. It's my sense of humor. I don't know. But moving on, even the legendary Vincent Price shows up in this, and everybody knows, if you watch the channel, if you know me in person, I'm a huge fan of Vincent Price. He's one of probably my favorite person ever in the world of horror. So he shows up as this kind of corporate ghoul, Arthur P. Loudermilk, and he lends this air of classic horror prestige to the proceedings. His presence is knowing, is a knowing wink to the audience. A stamp of approval from like horror royalty on this new breed of monster movie. Um, and for zombie purists who might scoff, I say this: Dead Heat explores a very fascinating subgenre of the undead. These aren't mindless, shamblers created by a virus or voodoo. They're these scientifically, reanimated corpses, products of just corporate greed and mad science, and retaining some semblance of their former selves. So they are, essentially these super soldiers who can't be killed because they're already dead. Um, it's a brilliant action movie twist on the zombie concept. One that really prioritizes spectacle and fun over dread and despair. And in a world saturated with zombie apocalypses, Dead Heat offers a refreshingly contained, personal, and just outrageously entertaining story. It's not about the end of the world. It's about one good cop having the worst and last day of his life. Um, it's a perfect Saturday night movie. A film that just kind of demands popcorn, maybe a few beers if you like that sort of thing. Um, just a group of friends who can really appreciate that fine art of a reanimated chicken attack. Uh, But the director of Dead Heat is a man that we've talked about many times here on the channel in the past, especially during my Schwarzenegger versus Stallone week. So while Dead Heat was his directorial debut, Mark Goldblatt is far more famous and influential for his work as a film editor. He's considered one of the masters of the craft, um, particularly in the action genre of the 1980s and the 90s. Um, his editing credits are legendary and really define that kind of cinematic language of an entire era of action filmmaking. Like the Terminator, Terminator 2, and Commando, Predator, True Lies, Rambo, First Blood Part 2, um, Starship Troopers. So several of those films I've covered here already on the channel, uh, and just his background as an editor is just profoundly felt in Dead Heat. The film is characterized by its kind of breakneck pace, dynamic shootouts, and just that tightly constructed action set pieces, which are all hallmarks of his editing style. Um, but while this was another film that was not a box office success upon its release, it has really cultivated a significant enduring legacy as this beloved cult classic. I think its impact can be broken down into several key areas. Whereas it was really the pinnacle of genre bending. Dead Heat is just quintessential example of that 1980s trend of genre fusion, which we've talked about in the previous two films tonight. You know, it defiantly refuses to be just one thing. You know, it's a buddy cop film in the vein of Lethal Weapon. You know, it's a high concept action movie like RoboCop. You know, it's a zombie comedy horror film like Return of the Living Dead, and just it's filled with all these one liners. You know, just this kind of audacious blend was too strange for mainstream audiences in 1988. But I think it's precisely what has endeared it to cult film fans who appreciate its unique and ambitious spirit. And then let's look at the effects on here. So this was a big thing, as why this appealed to so many, including myself. The film is a time capsule and a testament to that artistry of practical effects before the dominance of CGI. The work of effects artist Steve Johnson, who's known for Ghostbusters and Big Trouble in Little China, just to name a few. And this film, honestly, is got a very huge Big Trouble in Little China vibe to it, if you think about it. But just that work that Steve Johnson does on the effects here is a major highlight for the film. Like I said, that infamous butcher shop scene where these butchered animal parts are reanimated. It's an iconic moment, I think, in practical effects history. The melting man, the gruesome gunshot wounds, you know, Roger's gradual decay are all achieved with this tangible on-set effects that give the film a visceral and creative texture that is difficult to replicate with digital effects. So the film's legacy is really tied to this celebration of this bygone era of filmmaking craft. So, and that if you know me, I'm a huge guy when it comes to practical effects. I even considered going into that as a career at one point, but that didn't work out for me, unfortunately. But it is what it is. I'm glad to just be here and talk about these movies with you guys. But anyway, um, this film, it had this another part of its legacy is that it had this ultimate high concept premise. Um, the whole premise that a cop is murdered and brought back as a zombie. Excuse me, brought back as a zombie to solve his own murder is really a stroke of like B movie genius. It's this simple, you know, um, wild premise that just allows for endless, um, just endless possibilities and creative wise, and just this high concept approach made it a video store staple. Where I first found this film, I think I was just maybe a teenager at the time when I finally saw this film for the first time, but it was because I rented it from the video store. Um, and just the bizarre cover art and just that intriguing plot summary, practically leaped off the shelf to me. It's and I think its legacy is that of a perfect word of mouth film as well, much like how Night of the Creeps is. And it just was discovered, and shared by fans for its sheer audacity. And there's so many films out there like that, especially in the horror and sci-fi genres. Um, but while this didn't spawn a wave of direct imitators, Dead Heat stands, as I think as an important and early entry in that kind of modern action horror subgenre. It demonstrated that horror elements could be, successfully integrated into the framework of a mainstream action film without sacrificing either the thrills or the scares. And later films and video games even that blend that kind of high octane gunplay with supernatural or monstrous enemies, really owe a spiritual depth to that kind of go for broke attitude of Dead Heat. Um, but I guess in conclusion, Dead Heat is just this very awesome, chaotic, unapologetically, fun relic of the 1980s. It's a film that failed to find its audience in theaters, much like a lot of horror films in the 80s. But it was just destined for immortality on home video. And in the hearts of these genre fans. Propelled by that fantastic chemistry between Treat Williams and Joe Piscopo, is elevated by its masterful practical effects done by Steve Johnson, and just defined by its fearless blend of action and horror and comedy. It remains a singular achievement. So for those who appreciate creativity over convention and pure entertainment over prestige, um, Dead Heat is not just a cult movie. I think it's essential viewing as well. I think it's a testament to a time when filmmakers weren't afraid to be weird or wild and just just trying to be entertaining. So yeah, definitely check out Dead Heat. If you enjoy any of those genres that I've tied it to, whether it be horror, or it be comedy, whether it be action, that buddy cop subgenre, the horror comedy subgenre, there's just so much going on in this film, and just if you like extremely crazy, over the top practical effects, um, yeah, just definitely check this movie out, guys. If you've never seen it, um, it's essential viewing as a um, zombie movie fan. I think especially from the 1980s. Um, but I guess that is it for this video tonight, guys. I'll be back on Sunday for part 2 of Week of the Living Dead. So uh, you know, be sure to tune in for that. That one's gonna be a lot of fun as well. I had a blast doing this tonight's episode though, and I hope you guys enjoyed this just as much as I did doing it. I love talking about Night of the Living Dead and Day of the Dead, Night of the Comet, Night of the Creeps, Dead Heat with you guys. I mean, and just as a Romero fan, this this uh this was really important for me to do, and especially just a day after the 8-year anniversary of his death. Um, so, I hope you guys enjoyed everything that I had to say, all my different views and opinions on these films. I want to thank everyone who watched this live and was here in the chat, like my buddy Blake, my buddy Pop. Um, I want to thank everybody that's watching this on replay. So just thank you guys so much. It means more to me than you know. Uh, but I guess please drop me a comment below on what your favorite of these 5 films I talked about tonight, or if you have just another zombie film that you'd like to talk about or recommend or anything. Just drop me that below in the comments. I'd appreciate that. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. Um, let's see. If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button just to catch more videos from me like this one, and you can also click that bell for any kind of future notifications. So I think it usually gives you like a 30 minutes heads up, on as far as notifications go when my next video will be. So, but I'll just tell you now that my next video will be this Sunday. Will be part 2 of the Week of the Living Dead. So, just be sure to stay tuned for that. But I guess, guys, with all that said, I'm Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys. Have a good night.